Now. So.
All right. Well, welcome to episode 7 of the Team Dirt and Vert SquadCast. And today we have Julie. Is your last name Shobe? Is that how you pronounce it? Okay.
It is.
Julie Shobe.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Lots of people don't get that right.
I mean, I know how vowels and vowels work with the silent E at the end. And she is a nutritionist who specializes in ultra nutrition. And I actually worked with her and was very pleased with the things that I learned to improve my fueling. So we wanted to have her on and maybe help some of our listeners. So if you'll tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into nutrition, and then how you found yourself suddenly coaching ultra runners in this space, because this is a fairly new niche part of the ultra running world.
Totally. Thank you, Jen, for that introduction, and thank you, Greg, for having me on your guys' podcast. This is really fun. So so I became a dietitian a little over 12 years ago. I got interested. It's hard to even tell you why I got interested in nutrition, but I did, and found myself as a registered dietitian nutritionist. I worked in the clinical field for over 10 years. I've always been a runner. I got into long distance running in college, ran my first marathon, and then was dating my now husband at the time, and I think got him into long distance running too, because I ran a marathon before he did, and he was like, ooh, I think I need to do that. So then we just progressively got more into the longer and longer distances. My husband got a wild hair and decided to run a 100-mile run. I think about 7 years ago, somewhere in that time frame. And then I was like, well, then if you do an ultra, then I have to do an ultra. So I've yet to run a 100-mile, but I've done many 50Ks and a 50-miler and lots of just like fun long stuff on my own. So what got me into working with ultra runners, though, is I quit my clinical job about a little over a year ago, actually, wanting to do kind of my own thing in nutrition. And it wasn't until I went to, it's called the Rut Mountain Runs. It's in Big Sky, Montana. It's a really fun, awesome event if you can ever get in. The races are very intense and very challenging. The 50K is more like a 50-miler, just based off of how much time it takes to run it with all the vert and technical terrain. But anyway, I'm off topic. Anyway, this past fall we went, and I had 11 friends running, and 6 out of the 11 friends ran into some kind of fueling issue. 4 out of those 6 did not finish. And so it got me thinking, like, oh man, ultra running has been a part of my life for a very long time. Long distance running has been a part of my life for a very long time. I've helped my husband fuel for his 100-mile runs. I've helped my friends get their fueling down. And this could really be a niche that I could get into and be really excited about. Helping people do these long distance ultra marathons, because it really is a jump in knowledge base. You can get by. I'm not doing a whole lot for a marathon. Some 50Ks you can get by not doing a whole lot either.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. But when you go into those long distance running where you're running for 6, 8, 10, 20, 24 plus hours, then it's really a whole different game. So that's kind of the inspiration behind my private practice and starting to run with or to work with ultra runners.
The Rut is still one of my bucket list races.
Let me know when you go.
Yeah. So what's the altitude there?
The Lone Peak is at a little over 11,000 feet. I
Yep.
believe, and that's the highest point
So
of the race. And I
I
think
would,
it starts around 7.
yeah, I would imagine that contributed to the some of the nutrition issues that some of your friends had.
Totally. Yes. Elevation is for sure a factor. Most definitely. And underfueling.
Yeah, that is for sure. Could you explain the difference between a registered dietitian and nutritionist? Because I know that probably makes, it's like nails on the chalkboard when I said nutritionist and you're a registered
Not anymore.
dietitian. But I mean, I know there's a difference.
Yeah, it used to be a bigger deal. So it used to be that registered dietitians were very particular, and some still are, like, so you'll get some very traditional dietitians. We have a bachelor's degree, and then we go through a pretty extensive internship process, and then have to pass a national exam to become a registered dietitian. The credentials used to be just registered dietitian. They've actually added, so it's now our credentials are registered dietitian nutritionist. So some of us do refer to ourselves as a nutritionist, a registered nutritionist. I don't really care what you call me, but it used to be a bigger deal just because we didn't have that nutritionist. It's kind of, we're kind of like trying to take back that term and saying like, hey, we're actually the nutrition experts in the field, because there are a lot of people that do call themselves nutritionists or nutrition coaches that don't have that extensive education.
Right.
So yeah, good question. But if you're looking for somebody that's a well-qualified individual to get nutrition information from, registered dietitian or registered dietitian nutritionist, RD, RDN, that's the credential that you want to look for.
Gotcha. No, that's good. All right, well, let's start off with, let's just talk about some of the most common mistakes that ultra runners make, like me not eating early enough or enough, period. And like last weekend when I had my long run, I had I had 300 calories per hour.
All right.
Yeah. So I was like, heck yeah.
How'd you feel with that?
Oh, I felt great. I mean, you don't feel like crap when you finish, number one, and you feel much better later in the day. I mean, it makes a big difference. And I did do my recovery shake also after the run. So yeah, it was that was a good day. It's a win.
Awesome. Yay. So proud of you. So you asked, the question was, what are the biggest mistakes?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, the biggest mistake is underfueling. And that's oftentimes when I ask people what their biggest struggle is, it often comes out in a couple different ways. Like they say, I have a hard time eating enough. They say I have lack of appetite. They say I have nausea or stomach issues, stomach cramps, stomach bloat, right? Like, and all of those are reasons why we don't fuel with enough food. And ultimately that ends up slowing us down. And so we can't perform the way that we would prefer, especially for ultras where you're out there for hours and hours on end. So yeah, that's the biggest mistake, is just not fueling with enough food. Another mistake is waiting to start fueling. I see why this happens. A lot of times people think they don't need to eat anything for the first hour. Maybe they've oftentimes eaten breakfast or a snack before they go. So they're like, oh, that's taking care of me for my first hour of running. Well, that might be the case if you're only going for an hour or 2 hours. But if you are training for an ultra and maybe you're going for 2+ hours, then I actually recommend that you start fueling within that first hour. That's going to help train your stomach to tolerate food better, and you're going to feel better longer. So waiting kind of also gives your stomach an opportunity to kind of fall asleep, so to speak. And so if it falls asleep, it's not going to digest food very well. So if we can train our stomach to tolerate food even in that first hour, then you're setting yourself up to be able to digest that food better, mile or hour 8 down the road. You don't have to wake that stomach back up.
Yeah.
not enough salt is another mistake and that's one that I've personally made for a long time. Didn't pay attention to salt. But it's a very common thing where ultra runners can run the risk of what's called hyponatremia, and it's where your body's sodium level gets low, and it's because we're sweating out all of this sweat, right? And maybe we're hydrating with hydrating with plain water, and then the fuel that we're consuming is got some sodium in it, but not enough to replenish how much we're sweating out. And so then we end up getting this gap in our sodium, and so we get low in that. And if it's severe, it can be very severe if it gets to be a big enough problem for somebody. So utilizing salt tabs and electrolytes is definitely, or electrolyte beverage is definitely something I encourage my clients to do. So is paying attention to salt.
Yeah.
And that's going to be different too for everyone, right? Like everyone has different sweat rate, everyone, like heat elevation is all going to change that. So it's very different. But we can at least have a baseline where we start for that for people. And then dehydration is the other part of a big common mistake, is just not drinking enough fluid. And oftentimes people say I have a hard time remembering either to drink or to eat. And so that can lead to us getting behind on our hydration. And a common like side effect with that is feeling dry mouth or bloat in your stomach. And so if you're getting those two things, then I would encourage people to evaluate how much fluid they're drinking every hour.
Hey, on a related note to that, I think this may be a few years back, and I think anybody that when they first got into ultra running or trail running in general, or especially in Texas where it's always hot. Like, oh, you can't let, everyone's going to have cramps, but cramps not necessarily have to do with dehydration. It's just exertion as well. But then they're like, oh, you need to pound these salt sticks. And then I've had one person that I worked with, and I didn't know what she was doing at the time, but she was, I can't remember the number. It was obscene. She was taking so many salt sticks per hour. And I was like, I added it up. I was like, you know what? That was almost the whole bottle. So she was a fairly lean athlete. And she had a pretty good belly because she was swollen. Her fingers were puffy, and her tummy was puffy. And so I know I didn't give you much information, but I wondered if along the same lines of maintaining the right electrolyte balance. I think it's tough to say to err on too much electrolytes versus not enough, but obviously we can definitely have too many, and I always and it's also tough as a new runner to feel and hydrate by feel, whether versus I need to take so much electrolytes every hour. So I know I didn't really ask a question, but I don't know if you could
No,
jump on there and
totally
kind of get what I was getting at.
Totally, Greg. It's really common. Whenever I start talking about low sodium, then everyone's like, well, is there too much? So it's less of a risk. It's actually more of a risk for ultra runners to have hyponatremia than hypernatremia. That being said, yeah, if you are like taking the salt tabs, like maybe it says to take it, the bottle says to take it every 45 minutes, maybe you're taking 2 every 45 minutes plus drinking an electrolyte beverage, and you're doing that for hours and hours on end, then yeah, you might end up with too much salt. So fluid retention would be something that you would watch out for sure. Another thing that could happen that might cause a person to have hypernatremia or too much salt is maybe if it's cooler weather outside, and so you're not triggered to drink as much, but yet you're still supplementing sodium. So like maybe you're still taking your salt tabs, or maybe you're just drinking more of the electrolyte beverage and not any plain water. So that would be another situation where it could potentially happen. That being said, less likely for ultra runners to have that happen. But yeah, you bring up a good point.
Well, because ultra runners tend to overdo everything.
Right.
I mean, if a little bit is good,
Yep.
then a lot has to be better.
Right.
In every sense of the word. Food,
Yeah, we do tend to attract the extreme
mild.
personalities.
Okay, so do you have a typical recommendation for like an amount of fluids to take in per hour, or is that just something that a person would kind of try to find out themselves what works best?
Totally. And I realize I haven't given any like specific recommendations on any of these things, so I'm happy to share those with you guys. For fluid in particular, the lowest that I recommend people consume per hour is 14 ounces of fluid. And that's about a little bit more than 400 milliliters of fluid an hour. We get into really sticky waters with hydration. And so because everyone's rates are so different, and then like we have all these external factors that are really kind of change those numbers drastically. That's on the lower end of recommendations, is 14 ounces an hour or 400 milliliters an hour. In the research that I look at and follow for ultra running, the range is 400 to 800 milliliters an hour. And I'm sorry, I think it's 27 ounces of fluid is about 800 mils of water. So that would be kind of this range. If you fall outside of that range, it's totally fine if you're functioning good and you're like feeling good while you're running, right? So that's just kind of like the general guideline recommendations for fluid per hour. For salt, so once again, my recommendations are always on the low end because I want people to at least try and get to that number. And then if they feel like they need more, then they can go above that. So 250 milligrams, all these units floating around in my head, 250 milligrams of sodium per hour is what I recommend for ultra runners. And then a lot of people need quite a bit more than that. A lot of my clients they get maybe 350 or 450 an hour because that's what works best for them. But that 250 range is what I recommend starting with. The more complicated recommendation for sodium is 500 milligrams of sodium for every 1 liter of fluid that you're drinking. So that's where I get the 250 is because I'm hoping that you're at least drinking a liter of fluid every 2 hours. And so then it's half that, right? So 250 milligrams of salt is coming every hour. So that's where I get that recommendation from. I try and make things easy and digestible for people. So that's why I break them down this way.
People need it broken down for sure.
Yeah, totally. And then for carbs, it's 60 grams of carb an hour is what's recommended for ultra running, all the way up to 90 grams an hour. And I've met a few ultra runners, not a whole lot, that do actually consume 80 or 90 grams of carb per hour. But most people really struggle with even getting up to that 60 grams, but they feel a lot better when they get there. Yeah. And then the fourth piece that I do add on that I haven't talked about yet is protein. And so protein, there's a couple different reasons why I recommend it. One is it's in the research. Another is that it really does help settle people's stomachs. If you think about it, 60 grams of carb every hour for 8, 12, 18, 20, 24 plus hours is a lot of carbohydrates to be consuming, right? And our body needs to balance that out. And so some protein actually can be really helpful. So about 5 to 10 grams of protein an hour is what I recommend for that. And like you could find a protein, like I was looking at a Perfect bar today, and that has 17 grams of protein in it. And I believe 27 grams of carb. So if you ate that, then like that 17 grams of protein would cover you for about 3 hours. So then if all of your other foods that you're eating are higher in carbs for that 3 hours, that's fine. So you can kind of like think about it, break it down that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, and protein also helps actively repair and rebuild your muscles while you're running. So that's also really, really helpful. A lot of my clients notice they feel better after their training runs and after their ultra if they do prioritize consuming some protein during it, because it really does help not only settle their stomach, but it also makes their muscles feel a lot better. They're less sore. Yeah.
We a lot of times I'll, like in the middle of an ultra, I'll do Tailwind Rebuild, which is their recovery drink, but it has protein in it. And it goes down so easy too. It's very easy on the palate, and it's, you know, it's a quick 200 calories to dump in your stomach. But yeah, that's one way I get some protein in during a long race.
Yeah, Jen, that's like so good. They're people get hung up, right? Because it's marketed to recovery.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
There's no rules telling you that you can't drink a recovery drink while you're actually running.
Oh, exactly.
This was probably a couple years where I had been taking I think at the time they still called it Rebuild. And then I'd read a blog post or an article about, now I'm losing the gentleman's name, but he did Nolan's 14. So, you know, it's probably 40 hours just summiting the 14 peaks in the Salwatch mountain range, right, Jen?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it was self-supported, so he carried his tailwind, he carried his Rebuild, and I was like, you know what? I've been doing that, and I was like, what can that not be a mid-race drink? And I actually reached out to Tailwind, and they're like, no, and obviously I don't know who actually answered the email, and no, this should strictly be a post-race or a post-activity drink, but then that's changed because people experiment, and now it's a fairly accepted way. I mean, we've been, the old school ultra runners have been drinking Ensure cartons, and so I was like, if they can drink that, then we can drink Rebuild. So it's I think it's changed a little bit on I guess what's acceptable. I think I just wanted to piggyback off your answer regarding your recommendations. This is along the same lines as races like the Rut. What do your recommendations as far as, say, carb intake change when we get up to higher elevations? Where, so my understanding that when we get up into the Leadvilles of the world, our carb burning, I'm going to say it all wrong, but we're burning more carbs than we would at lower elevations. Do you recommend changing some of those or upping that intake for those type of races?
That's a really good question. And 60 grams of carb is just that general recommendation, right? So, and you're right, when we're up at those higher elevations, we do tend to need more of our nutrition. So that's one thing to consider if you are running a higher elevation race. I always encourage people to try and practice and get training races up there. And that's going to be the best indicator to somebody whether or not they need something more, or if that 60 grams is going to be sufficient for them. And for some people, 50 grams an hour is sufficient for them too, right? Like it doesn't have to be 60. It's just this general guideline around that number. So in general though, yeah, like ideally you're probably consuming a little bit more, but get to that place or get to a training run where you can emulate that higher elevation, to where you can actually see if your body responds in a different way that you need more.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. Good
so
question.
Do you have any differences in fueling recommendations between, like, less than a marathon versus marathon and 50K or above?
Yeah, so for most marathon training, you can get by with like 30 to 60 grams of carb an hour. And like protein isn't nearly as much of an issue. Most marathons are going to take people less than 6 hours to run. So that protein recommendation doesn't necessarily stand for marathon training. And I don't specialize in the marathon, I focus much more on the ultra running to like that jump up there, but I do know that. And then the sodium recommendation is also going to be slightly less. But you know what? I follow some marathon dietitians on Instagram, and a lot of times I do see that their sodium recommendations are very similar to mine, if not even a little bit more. So
Interesting.
but I like to stay I like to be a little more conservative with my recommendations.
Yeah.
So
Start low, go high.
Yep, exactly.
That applies to so many things in life. So what about pre-race fueling? I mean, do you feel like just, having your breakfast is sufficient, or should you have a snack right before you start the race, or what is your recommendation on that?
Yeah, so if we're talking in the context of starting an ultra marathon, like it's starting line of, let's say, like a 50 miler, then for carb, I actually recommend, and this is the same recommendations for marathon training too, is to actually increase your carb intake 4 or 5 days in advance. It takes less pressure off of eating so much for breakfast and dinner the night before, right? But also our body does have that capability to build up those glycogen stores over a few days rather than just like cram it all in right before. So I like what's recommended for ultra runners is to be consuming a high carbohydrate diet on a regular basis. So that's like 50 to 60% of our food is coming from carbohydrates. When we're carb loading and leading up to that starting line of your ultra marathon, then we actually want to aim for like 70 to 80% of our, or 70% of our carbohydrates coming, or of our diet coming from carbohydrates. And people, like, that doesn't just have to be breads and rice and pasta. Like, carbs come from a lot of things. They come from milk, it comes from yogurt, it comes from fruit. Vegetables are all carbohydrates. Carrots are carbohydrates. And then corn and potatoes and peas and squash are all carbohydrates. They're higher in carbs than, of course, the carrots are. So, and beans and lentils, all of those foods are carbohydrates. So it doesn't, we say that and we're like, oh my gosh, I just have to eat cereal for like, days on end. That's not true. A lot more carbs from other
Do we
places.
have to say, so if we're tapering or preparing for, a Saturday or Sunday race, do we have to balance, say, we've decreased our training load 60, 80%, or do we have to take into account the less activity that we're doing while still trying to, optimize the carb intake? So we just can't, we can't just eat the same amount that we did, 3 weeks before when we were peaking.
That's a good question. Whenever I get a how much to eat question, my answer is always, that's between you and your body. Your body has a built-in mechanism called hunger that is a really good indicator for how much you need to eat. So even though you might be tapering and running significantly less miles, your hunger might still be really high. And that's okay. That actually means, hey, your body is like still needing all of these extra nutrients from all of that crazy training that you were just doing. And then listen to that. Your body's going to be better off because of it if you're listening to your hunger. If your hunger isn't like there, and I mean, obviously I want you to eat, but if your hunger is less or you're satisfied faster, then by all means, that's totally fine. Like, you don't have to eat as much. So we have a really good built-in mechanism in our body. that being said, our society and our culture likes us to believe that we can't trust our hunger skills or our hunger cues and our society cues. So if you find that you're somebody that's like, I feel like I'm very disconnected to my hunger cues for when I'm feeling hungry and when I'm feeling full, then I definitely recommend those people to look into a resource called it's intuitive eating. And there's actually a workbook that you can buy that really helps. Yeah, you could go through a couple pages a day and it really helps identify, okay, like what are my mental views on food? What are these food rules that I've been following for a long time? And then identifying all of these like messages that we're getting from culture about our hunger, and how much we should or shouldn't eat, or what foods are good or bad. And so anyway, so that is the resource that I recommend that people go to, or find it. There's lots of dietitians that specialize in intuitive eating as well that can help people specifically who are like, I really don't think I have hunger cues, because they might be buried down there, but you can find them, and it might just take some time.
Yeah.
That's my answer. Is that okay, Greg?
Yeah, definitely good. Okay, I have one more question, because I was on the treadmill and I was watching YouTube, and I'm going to first caveat that we should never, I don't want to say never, but we shouldn't take into account a lot of what elite in this case was an elite marathoner, and he was talking about his pre-race meal or pre-race breakfast. Typically, he's probably doing toast, peanut butter, half a banana. But he's like, you know what? I was at this race and I had a Pop-Tart and it was great, and now he's just going to eat Pop-Tarts before every race. Again, elite marathoner running 100 miles a week and probably hit the genetic lottery as well, so he could probably eat whatever he wants because he trains as much as he does. But also, I mean, from a pure, I guess, caloric and macro level, if we just single it out into one race, is there any big advantage to having a quote healthier toast, peanut butter, banana versus processed Pop-Tart? Or either way,
Nutrient dense. That's what you're looking for.
Yeah.
That's the word you're looking for.
That's like the fancy word that us dietitians like to use, nutrient dense or less. Or I like to refer to like candy or Pop-Tarts as like play food.
Yeah.
That's the term I like to use.
That's a good one.
No, you're gonna find, so you will find dietitians, and myself included, that are like, hey, if a Pop-Tart works for you before you go for a run or before you race, because you know that it is digested really well and it doesn't give you the poops or something, then by all means eat the Pop-Tart. That's okay. And that's something that intuitive eating also helps with, is like, okay, why do I view a Pop-Tart as being maybe this like more negative, less healthy choice compared to a piece of toast and peanut butter? Like where down the line did I get these messages? And yeah, so anyway, Pop-Tarts, if they work for you, and you will find running dietitians on Instagram that will say, hey, eat a Pop-Tart before you go for a run, because it's actually a great amount of carbs and it's easily digestible, and it's that energy that's gonna sustain you for your 1 or 2 hour run that you're going. So yeah, that's my answer there, is if it works for you, then good. If you don't like Pop-Tarts, like I personally don't really like Pop-Tarts, so that's not going to be my choice. Like I will go for a bowl of cereal and a piece of toast and peanut butter and maybe a banana if I can like stomach it before my race.
Is there a slippery slope there? So definitely, just, I mean, like, I guess it's a bad metaphor, but if I drink one beer, then the rest of my nutrition kind of falls apart. If I this is probably a little too much telling about myself, but is there a slippery slope to Well, if it's okay to, I don't know, does that open it up to unhealthy eating? Not to say that Pop-Tarts are bad, but um, I don't know.
So
I don't know if there's a
yeah,
question there.
yeah, I think I can give you a response. So we have lots of research to show that if our body has an elevated need for something like carbohydrates or like sodium, it's better for us to meet those needs than to
Okay.
not, right? So, and like particularly with glycemic index, right? So like a Pop-Tart would be a higher glycemic index food that's gonna spike our blood sugar faster and be broken down faster. But if the need is there for that, then we don't see detrimental health effects from it. At least that's the research that I've read that makes me really happy because it's like, okay, yeah, we're going for an 8-hour trail run in the woods, and I need a lot of easily digestible carbs that are going to be able to give me energy pretty quickly. And so that's like a gel or honey stinger chews, that's what that food is. And that's not going to give me any negative health effects because I'm eating that, but like because I have an increased need for that carbohydrate, and that's the best option to replenish my body with that at that point in time. The only thing that I can think of really is dental caries. So one of my suggestions actually, like cavities. I don't know why I said caries. That makes me sound like, oh, my daughter just
Like a
got
Wow.
dentist.
Okay.
that. I told them to be quiet when they got home, but clearly.
Oh, okay. Arriving home is exciting.
Yeah. Mouthwash though is like such an awesome tip that I've been like telling all my clients and sharing on podcasts, because it not only helps clean our mouth when we're running, because you'd brush your teeth twice a day if you're running 24 hours, right? Like hopefully maybe even 3 times in that period of time. And so mouthwash is a good way to not only clean out your mouth, get that like sugar residue out of there, but also it kind of replenishes your palate.
Yep.
So your
disposable toothbrushes.
Good idea.
Yeah.
Or just brush your teeth.
I like
Yeah.
those little
It wakes you up.
Toothbrushes.
Yep.
Those little, yeah.
The little picks.
Yeah. Or like, I don't know, they're little Colgate. They've got a little bit of freshener in them.
Yeah, they've already got it in the toothbrush. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always have those. Back to like the whole Pop-Tart thing. I have heard several dietitians say that, I mean, because when we're doing these long efforts, we know that blood is funneled away from our stomach to our extremities, and that when we will consume processed foods, we're actually helping our gut because they've already been processed and partially broken down, and then it just makes it so much easier for our gut, for our stomach to break that down, and then for our gut to get that out to the blood cells a lot quicker. So that's what I always try to think about whenever I'm feeling guilty about. I don't eat Pop-Tarts, but I just don't like the crust around the edges. If they made the whole thing, frosting and left the crust off the edges, it'd be perfect.
They need to make uncrustable Pop-Tarts.
Yes, that's exactly what they need to do. And that BS with those little Pop-Tarts, like they're in a packet, and they're like little teeny Pop-Tarts. No, that does not have nearly enough jelly inside for me. Like, no, it's way too much crust.
Oh, the Pop-Tart conversation is so funny. I love it.
So what about caffeine? When do you recommend using caffeine?
Yeah, caffeine. I'm pro caffeine.
Me too.
Yeah, I think caffeine is awesome. That being said, there's people that don't like caffeine because it causes GI upset, or maybe it causes them to go poop. And so they don't like it, which is totally fine. It is also a diuretic, so that's something to consider. So you want to definitely make sure that you are consuming enough plain water or electrolyte beverage in addition to whatever caffeine that you're taking in. I am like, let's talk about before and then during. Is that what you're kind of hoping?
Yeah.
Okay. So before you start ultra marathon or even like a long distance training run, I'm a huge fan of having a cup of coffee, not only to help you wake you up in the day, but also caffeine does help you poop. So if you give yourself enough time, I always recommend at least 90 minutes of like eating a breakfast and finishing and starting something long, particularly a race. Then give yourself 90 minutes. That gives your body enough time to digest that caffeine, and then hopefully you don't have to go poop on the trail then, right? Because then you've like taken care of it before you go.
We definitely want to try to avoid that.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's my 2 cents about caffeine. Very pro caffeine, especially before you start. During, so if you're running like a 50K, or maybe if you're doing a 50 miler that you don't think is necessarily going to take you into the evening, caffeine like is totally optional if you want to have it or not. It can be helpful for awareness. It can be helpful for giving you an extra boost in energy. There's also some research to show that it actually helps you absorb carbohydrates better. So if you want to utilize it in a 50K or a 50 miler, or like maybe something 12 hours or under, I should put it that way, then totally by all means, just practice with it first, because if you don't practice with it, you're not going to know how your digestive tract is going to handle it while you're running. So you definitely need to practice. If you're doing something overnight or that's going to take you into the night, then I highly, highly recommend consuming caffeine if you're okay with it. There are some religious beliefs that don't, like caffeine, and that's totally fine. You don't have to have it. But it can be really helpful for awareness. And, like it gets dark, you're wearing a headlamp. Maybe I've paced my husband in the middle of the night multiple times during his 100-mile runs. And the man gets out of it, right? Like you're just, you trip more easily, you fall. Like it's just a more of a mess at nighttime. So caffeine can be really, really helpful in doing that. And then I recommend, for how much, I recommend spacing it out every hour or so, every 1 to 2 hours. And then there is a calculation because there is too much caffeine that will, if you have too much caffeine, it'll actually have negative effects on your performance. So how you get that number, how you calculate that number is you take your body weight in pounds, then you divide it by 2.2 to get your body weight in kilograms. So body weight in pounds divided by 2.2 to get your body weight in kilograms. Then you take your body weight in kilograms and multiply it by 9. And that's going to give you your max amount of milligrams of caffeine that you would want to consume in a 24-hour period of time.
Wow.
That being what?
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah. So it's, I think I've, like, don't quote me on this, but I think I've done this example for my group a couple of times where if somebody's about 150 pounds, then the math eventually I think comes out to be about 600 milligrams of caffeine within a 24-hour period of time. A cup of coffee is typically around 200 milligrams of caffeine. Don't quote me on all of this. This is just like the top of my brain, so you might have to double check. But Red Bull, I think, is around 95 or 100 milligrams. You can get gels and chews. Oftentimes, those are low. Those are like 25 to maybe 50 milligrams of caffeine in them. If you drink like 12 ounces of Coke, that's about, I believe it's 35 or 40. Most caffeinated pops or sodas, depending on where you're from in the United States, whether you call it pop or soda. I grew up in Minnesota, so it's pop for me. But so yeah, most pops are 12 ounces, about 35 milligrams of caffeine. So all of those are great options. You just pick which one like speaks to your taste buds and that you actually want to try out. So
very good.
Oh, my door is closed. My daughter's being very loud. Sorry about that.
No worries. No worries.
So does that answer your caffeine
Yeah,
question?
that's good. That's really good. Well, we have a couple of other questions that aren't actually specific to ultra running, but a couple of people had asked, do you have any advice regarding fueling runs for those who have to avoid carbs due to high blood sugar levels?
Yeah. So I mentioned that I worked in clinical as a clinical dietitian for over 10 years, and I actually specialized in diabetes education. That's what I did.
Oh, wow.
So, which is a big reason why I talk about carbs so much. Like, oh, this transfer is really great for ultra runners, because definitely recommend like looking at the carbs because we need it. So for somebody with diabetes, definitely needs to be working with, if they're going to be doing something like this, definitely have them be working with somebody that specializes in diabetes, right? So a certified diabetes educator or a dietitian that really knows blood sugars quite well. There is, you know, if your blood sugar is 250 or higher, then running or working out is actually not a good idea. You need to bring your blood sugar down, because that stress that exercise induces will actually cause your blood sugar to go up rather than go down.
Wow.
So that being said, if somebody with diabetes, and I'm assuming that it's type 2 diabetes, this question, not type 1, then it really is just a game of watching what your blood sugars are doing while you're running. And most likely you're still going to need to eat plenty of carbohydrates, because that physical exertion is there and your body is going to have a need for those carbohydrates for that energy. So to avoid carbohydrates, this is so sticky because I worked in this field, so I know it's so individualized, but most likely that person is still going to need carbohydrates while they're running. They just need to be a little bit more mindful of watching what their blood sugars are doing. So if they can get a hold of a continuous glucose monitor to watch their blood sugar, that is really going to be ideal for them. If they're type 1 and they're insulin dependent, then that also is very individualized, and they more than likely would potentially be able to get away with not having to need as much insulin, right? Like, so they can eat their carbs, and then their blood sugar is actually going to be worked down because of how much running they're doing. So they wouldn't necessarily need as much insulin there. So that all be said, these are very general. All of what I said is
all general.
Yeah. It's all general recommendations. And if you need individual advice, then to definitely talk to a certain, like a well-qualified medical individual. So
okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's wrap it up with this question. We all need to have our recovery foods especially after training runs and after races. Do your recommendations for your recovery food or shake, do they change depending on how long you've been out? Or if you've been fueling properly, it's just your normal, like, 2 hour or less snack after your run sufficient?
That is a really great question. So in general, the shorter the workout, probably the smaller the snack, right? The longer the workout, the more sufficient the snack. Where really what we're looking for is still that like 50% is coming from carbs, 25 to 30% is coming from protein, and the rest of it is going to be coming from fat or fruits and vegetables that you're being sprinkled in there, or a beverage of some sort or something. So I do try and keep it pretty simple and like, let's not make this super complicated. But yeah, so like if you're going out for a 2-hour run, then a banana and peanut butter, especially if you fueled really well during that, and you've like maybe you've even 2-hour runs, you've consumed 120 grams of carb during that, right? Because you're training for an ultra, so you want to fuel like you're training for an ultra on your training runs. So maybe a banana and peanut butter is sufficient. If you're going for an 8-hour run, then most definitely maybe a banana, peanut butter, Greek yogurt, slice of toast with peanut butter, or I added lots of peanut butter in that example, but that would be, maybe you would want some more. But yeah, there is in general kind of a window of time. It's within about 30 minutes of finishing that you want to try and have at least a little bit of a snack right after you get done, and then have a more substantial meal within like 2 hours of finishing. So there's that kind of time range that you want to hopefully get in.
Yeah. That's a hard thing to get. That's a hard habit to get into as well. I mean, it is. And I think, a lot of us are like, I feel during my run, I don't really need to, but I most definitely feel better the rest of that day and the next day when I practice that.
I love that you bring that up, Jen, because most people do. They realize that they're less sore is one thing that I hear really commonly, less tired. And so oftentimes, we feel like we have to like take a nap after we go for a long run. Oftentimes people say that goes away when they start to fuel well, which I think is a really cool side effect.
Yeah. And I'm sorry.
No,
go ahead.
That's fine.
Well,
I was going to say your appetite is more controlled too.
But that kind of goes back to the middle of the night and the ultra. Like if you fueled better during the day, you won't be as sleepy overnight. I mean, you're still going to be sleepy, but I find that I don't get as sleepy.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up.
All right. Well, this was fun. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for.
We could talk on that long, but your babies are home.
Yes, my wild 4-year-old is back in the house, so I get to go play with her. So, but do you mind if I tell people where they can find me?
No, yes, go ahead, and we'll put it in our little. We'll put it out on the show notes.
Perfect. Yeah. So the best place to find me is on Instagram. My handle is at ultra.runner.nutrition. And if you're interested in getting help like Jen did, and helping with fueling, knowing what to eat and when, if you're like struggle with stomach issues and want to overcome those so you can finish your ultra the best way possible, then I do have the 6-week small group program and if you're interested, you click the link in my bio, fill out it's like 2 or 3 minute questionnaire, and then you'll get another screen to schedule a 20-minute phone call with me to see if the program will benefit you. So yeah,
and it's definitely, I'm glad that I did it. It was worth it. It was definitely worth it.
Thank you, Jen. I appreciate it. You were really fun to have in the 6-week program.
All right. Well, I guess that wraps it up.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for
Thank
coming on.
you, Dirt and Vert.
Thanks.
Yeah.